Good evening. Welcome to the chapel. My name is Dave Gustafson, and I serve as senior pastor here on behalf of the chapel. We're glad you're here tonight. Many years ago when I was beginning pre-med studies at Virginia Tech, I was spiritually hungry, and I was spiritually curious, but I was also spiritually skeptical. I'm just naturally wired as an analytical person, and so I've never been able to believe something just because people say I should believe it. So when I started university studies, I had questions, and I had a lot of them. And so I really searched out people to engage with on those questions. And I can remember late night talks in the dorm. I can remember good conversations in the frat house with fraternity brothers, in side rooms with keg parties raging next door. I can remember debating with members of the student Christian fellowship group. I even remember a conversation with this old white-haired religion professor who reminded me a lot of Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. So, man, I just asked my questions, and I think in the back of my mind, I was kind of testing the people that I was talking to, because I wanted to know, would they respond to my questions defensively? Would they make me feel dumb for asking my questions? Would I discover that they were actually pretty ignorant about this faith that they say that they had? And some of the people were like that. There was some disappointment. But I would say for the most part, so many of those conversations were respectful, were thoughtful. People were patient with me. People were honest, sometimes admitting that they didn't have great answers to all the questions that I had. I so appreciated the tenor of so many of those conversations. And in many of those people, I saw evidence in their life of something that I wanted. I saw a love and a way they approached life that seemed to give credence to this thing they said that they believed. Many of those people I engaged with during those first few years of college encouraged me to keep asking questions, to keep seeking truth. A few of them reminded me that, look, at the end of the day, the ultimate question really is, what do you think about Jesus? And so through that long process, I came to own and really believe that Jesus is who he said he was. And that faith has just shaped me profoundly. So I will forever be grateful for those honest, thoughtful, patient conversations that led me to faith. And that's why we're here tonight. We are here in a cultural moment that is very strained and very angry. Right? Sometimes the tenor of our public discourse seems like the opposite of patient, thoughtful, respectful conversation. So I hope that tonight feels like kind of an oasis, kind of a refuge from the divisiveness and the anger that's all around us. I hope that you feel that this is a place that you can be honest, that you can honestly ask questions. Because I know you have questions. Some of your questions are probably intellectual in nature. Hasn't science disproven at least parts of the Bible? Does the Bible contradict itself? How can you say that there's a God who's all-powerful and good, and yet I see the suffering that I see all around me? And some of your questions are probably even more personal than that. And so we just want you to know that your questions are welcome here. They're not a threat to faith. If something is really true, then we don't need to be afraid of putting it under scrutiny and examining that thing. It's no secret that for the past few decades, fewer and fewer people in our country identify as Christians, or for any religion, for that matter. And even institutions that are associated with Christianity, many of them have lost the cultural influence that they used to have. Some of them have lost all credibility. And yet at the same time, there's something else happening. Especially since the pandemic, especially in younger people, there is a noticeable increase in spiritual interest. Bible sales in our country are spiking. Since 2022, 42% rise in the sale of Bibles in our country. That's significant. In many regions, church attendance is surging. And here at the chapel, this past fall, we saw almost 20% more people coming to church than we did a year earlier. So the hunger for truth is very much alive. People are searching, and it's that shared search that brings us together tonight. So whether you walked through those doors as a committed believer or a devout atheist or somewhere in between, I want to just invite you to open your heart, open your mind to what you hear tonight. I really hope that when you walk out of here tonight, you will be taking with you something that was really, really valuable to you. So let me just give you a little preview of how this night is going to work. In a moment, I'm going to invite up Rebecca, and she's going to speak for about 45 minutes or so. After that, we've set aside a good chunk of time for question and answer. So if you would like to submit a question for consideration, a couple ways you can do that. You can use the QR code with your phone. That's right up behind me, and that will open up a form where you can put in a question. You can also, if that doesn't work, you can also just go to, you can see the URL there, thechapel.org/Q&A, Q&A. That will take you to the same page. If you're not technologically savvy, I suppose you could tiptoe back to the tech booth and slip a piece of paper to someone. And so we'll get those questions, and Rebecca's going to respond to as many of those as she can. So it's now my privilege to introduce tonight's speaker. Rebecca McLaughlin was born and raised in the UK. She holds a doctoral degree in Renaissance English literature from Cambridge University. She also has a degree in theology from Oak Hill College in London. She has written a lot of books, Confronting Christianity, on which this seminar tonight is based, and which was in 2020 named Christianity Today's Apologetics Book of the Year. Some of the other books that she has written are Jesus Through the Eyes of Women, The Secular Creed, and most recently, How Church Could Literally Save Your Life. She's married to Brian. She lives now in Cambridge, Massachusetts, from whence she almost didn't get here tonight because of weather up in Boston. We're so glad that she made it. They have 3 kids together, and Rebecca is really in high demand as a speaker all over the world, so I just consider ourselves really privileged to have her here tonight. So would you join me in welcoming to our stage, Rebecca McLaughlin.
Thanks so much, Dave. I appreciated the from whence she came. You know, a little bit of archaic English for the English girl. You should know 2 things about me just from the first few seconds that you've seen me. One is that I'm English, which you already knew, but you can hear from my accent, right? So almost anything I say you're going to believe just because I've got this, strange English accent. It seems to work on Americans. The other is that I'm a risk taker because I wore these white pants all the way from Boston and I didn't have a backup pair. So, if I'm not covered in grime from either Boston or New York, then, this is a miracle, a modern day miracle, a post-Christmas miracle, let's call it, that I'm here, reasonably presentable before you today. As Dave said, one of the things that I have been passionate about for much of my life, and the reason I actually wrote Confronting Christianity, my first book, is that I am very keen to have the kinds of conversations that Dave was talking about. Real honest conversations with people who have really good reasons for not believing what I believe about Jesus. And I want to take those questions really seriously, and if you are one of those people here tonight, I'm really looking forward to the Q&A time. And I would love for your questions to be prioritized. So don't feel like, oh, well, there are lots of other people here. I'm not going to ask a question. Please put in a question. I would love to engage with that. And if you think everything I've said is completely stupid, feel free to say that. Because I'm English, I'm actually not easy to offend. We Brits have a pretty sort of thick skin. So feel free to go straight in there. One of the problems that we Brits have, though, and it's kind of like a congenital condition, is that wherever we go, we have to talk about Harry Potter. So if you have not read the books or seen the films, I'm going to need you to block your ears or something for the next couple of minutes because I'm going to drop the most horrific spoiler. And if you haven't read the books but you plan to, you're a little bit late, but welcome. Then I would hate to be the person who ruined that for you. But if you have read the books or if you've seen the films, then you will remember that in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, J.K. Rowling basically sticks a knife into her readers' hearts. So Professor Dumbledore is the Gandalf of the series. He's the only man whose power for good can match Lord Voldemort's evil. But in the 6th book, a weakened Dumbledore stands at the top of the astronomy tower, surrounded by his enemies, and he appeals to Harry's teacher nemesis, Severus Snape, for help. Severus, please, and Snape kills him. The scene is absolutely devastating. We never liked Professor Snape, but we hope beyond hope that he was Dumbledore's man, and now his betrayal of his mentor is complete. It's only in the last book that we realized how wrong we were. When Harry dives into the Pensieve, this kind of magical bowl where you can dive into somebody else's memories. And there we see that everything that Snape has done has been driven by his passionate, hopeless, unrequited love for Harry's mother. We see Snape's anguish as Lily Potter is murdered by Voldemort and how he thenceforth commits himself to Dumbledore. We hear Dumbledore telling Snape that he is dying from the slow workings of an irreversible curse and making Snape promise to kill him when the moment comes. And suddenly the meaning of Severus, please, is reversed. When many of my friends up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, look over at the Christian faith, they see a lot of things that look like Snape killing Dumbledore. They see a white-centered religion with a history of racism and scriptures that condone slavery. They see an anti-intellectual mindset and a contradictory Bible that's been disproved by science again and again. They see homophobia, the denigration of women, and a refusal to acknowledge that love is love. But just as when we dive into Snape's memories, we realize that his story is not a story of hate, but a story of love. So when we look at each of these seemingly devastating roadblocks to faith in Jesus, I think they actually become a signpost. For many in our culture today, and certainly over the last couple of decades, there's been this idea that Christianity is simply in decline. And it's like the tide is sort of going out on religious belief in general, on Christianity in particular. But I think the reverse is the case. And I think for all of us, regardless of where we stand today, when it comes to that question of who is Jesus, for all of us, we need to do some serious thinking. And I would like to suggest tonight that we do that thinking around three areas of investigation. Number one, I think we need to rethink diversity. Number two, we must rethink the university. Number three, we must rethink morality. And number four, we must rethink sexuality. But we must do all of these things with humility, and actually not by watering the scriptures down, but by lapping them up. So number one, we must rethink diversity. On the 23rd of February of 2019, a Nigerian street preacher named Olawale Elisanme stood outside a train station in my hometown of London, preaching to the commuters as they went by. Two white British police officers came up to him and gave him a choice: go away or be arrested. I will not go away, Mr. Elisanme replied, because I need to tell them the truth. And Jesus is the only way, the truth, and the life. They don't want to listen to that, the officer said. They want you to go away. You don't want to listen to that? Mr. Elisanme replied. You will listen when you are dead. You will listen when you are dead. And so he was arrested. What do we make of this story? For me, as a follower of Jesus, it's encouraging to see a brother in Christ standing so boldly for his faith. But also the fact of a Nigerian street preacher preaching the offensive message of Jesus' exclusive claims on all of us, while sort of white Europeans like me block their ears, is a little parable for the religious world today. See, if you go back 40 years, then every sociologist of religion was basically saying that religion was in decline. Now, as the world became more modern, more scientific, more educated, that religious belief would naturally sort of flow away. But not only has that prophecy failed to come true in the last 40 years, now as experts look out over the next 40 years, they anticipate actually an increasingly religious world. So right now, Christianity is the largest global belief system, with about 31% of the world identifying as Christian. And rather than declining, that proportion is actually set to increase slightly to 32% by 2060. The second largest belief system in the world is Islam. And the proportion of Muslims in the world is set to increase significantly from about 25% to about 31%, making it a very close competitor with Christianity. Hinduism and Buddhism are set to decline slightly in that time. But here's the real shock. The proportion of people who don't identify with any religion, so that includes atheists, agnostics, or people who would just say none if you gave them a census form and said, what religion are you? That proportion is set to decrease from 16% to 13%. So the tide isn't going out on religion globally, it's actually coming in. Now this comes as a surprise to many of my secular friends. But what's perhaps even more surprising is that Christianity is the belief system of diversity. Whether you look at race or geography or nationality or socioeconomics or gender, Christianity is by far the most diverse belief system in the world. Now, this shouldn't actually be too surprising if you've ever opened up a Bible. Because if you open up the Bible, and especially if you open up in the New Testament, you start reading the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, these sort of 4 short biographies of Jesus we have in the Bible, then one of the things you'll notice is that Jesus broke through every racial and cultural barrier of his day. And then he told his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations, so to spread his message around to everybody else. Now, we don't always notice that Jesus is doing this because the racial and cultural barriers of our day are different from the ones of his day. So if I asked you, what do you know about Samaritans? If you know anything about Samaritans, you know they're good, right? Jesus had this famous story of the Good Samaritan. But for Jews of Jesus' day, if you knew anything about Samaritans, you knew they were bad. And Jesus, in that story, in his treatment of Samaritans, he actually kind of completely reversed how people of his place and ethnicity would have been supposed to think. He told his followers, you've got to actually love the people you were raised to hate. And then if you read through the rest of the New Testament, these fascinating documents we have about the early church, the very first Christians, one of the distinctive things about them was that they were this whole hodgepodge of people. Is hodgepodge an American term? Sorry, sometimes I say English things and people just look at me blank. I'm like, maybe hodgepodge. I've never said hodgepodge from a stage before, and now thank you for nodding. I feel better. It was a hodgepodge of people from all sorts of different backgrounds. It was people who were categorized as Jews and categorized as Greeks or sort of non-Jews at the time. It was people who were categorized as barbarians, which was a sort of rude term that a lot of the Romans in the day had for those who sort of weren't Romans, those uneducated masses out there. It was for them, and it was for Scythians, which was this sort of strange kind of scary group of people who were actually particularly known for being very white and also particularly known for being often enslaved. And it was for both enslaved people and for free people. It was this strange mixing together of all sorts of kinds of people in this unity, this family of church. Christianity was diverse from the very beginning, kind of by design. And if you read through right to the end of the Bible, to this fascinating book called the Book of Revelation, you see that people from every tribe and tongue and nation are worshiping Jesus together. Now, if you, like me, are a follower of Jesus, this is our destiny, and it's actually also becoming our reality. As we look around at the global church today, we see people from increasingly every tribe and tongue and nation worshiping Jesus. As people look at those demographics of what the church is going to look like around the world by 2060, they expect that about 40% of the world's Christians will live in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, China today is the global center of atheism, but the church in China has been growing so fast that some experts think that there could be more Christians in China than America very soon, and even that China could become a majority Christian country in the next several decades. So when my friends think and hear the word diversity, they imagine it's kind of the opposite of Christianity. And when they hear the word evangelism, this strange term we use for sort of telling other people about Jesus, they imagine kind of white Westerners like me forcing their beliefs down other people's throats. But what happens when we realize that actually most of the Christians around the world are neither white nor Western? And increasingly most evangelists are also neither white nor Western? Then the exclusive message of Jesus becomes harder for some of my friends up in Cambridge, Massachusetts to dismiss. Because when Olawale Ilesanmi told those British police officers that Jesus is the only way, the truth, and the life, he wasn't saying, my culture's cooking is better than yours. He was saying, I was starving too, till I found bread. So let's rethink diversity. Because Christianity is the most multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial movement in all of history. Second, we must rethink the university. A few years ago, I took a friend of mine from grad school in the UK to an event at Harvard where the agnostic chair of the Harvard philosophy department was doing a kind of debate with a New Testament scholar called N.T. Wright. And my friend is one of the smartest guys I know. It would not surprise me at all if he wins a Nobel Prize one day. Like, he's that kind of level, like crazy level smart. And he's culturally Jewish and convictionally atheist. And after the event, I said to my friend, I know that you think that what I believe is crazy. And his then girlfriend, who was a much gentler soul than either of us, said, I'm sure he doesn't think that. I said, yes, he does. I believe that the entirety of human history revolves around this first century Jewish man who died on a cross and was supposedly raised to life 3 days later. Crazy, right? My friend said yes. I said that the problem is, I think that you believe some crazy things as well. See, many of my friends who don't believe in God, they think that they're sort of standing on this solid secular ground, and they're looking over at Christianity and with all our crazy beliefs about people rising from the dead and that kind of thing. And that's the comparison that they're making. Like, why would I go and stand in this like crazy circle where people are claiming that there are folks rising from the dead when I could be standing on my perfectly solid secular ground here? But in reality, what my friends who don't believe in God are doing is this. Oh, I got somebody who wasn't looking to look up there. I'm pleased with that. They're stepping off into an abyss. Because actually and we'll talk about this more in a few minutes when we talk about morality, but many of my most secular friends' beliefs about the world aren't actually coming from their atheism. They're coming from Christianity. And their beliefs about what the world is like and what human beings are just actually don't really fit together. In reality, and I say this, there are people in this room probably twice my age and people in this room half my age, so I'm coming up on 46. And one of the things I'm pretty convinced about at this time in my life is that everybody believes crazy stuff. Like there's no perfectly coherent belief system that doesn't include crazy stuff, and that actually Christianity is the least crazy of all the crazy options. And one of the things that I think is going to have to happen in the next few years, and I think is starting to happen already, is that universities across the Western world are going to have to start reckoning with Christianity again. You see, for the last couple of decades, several decades at this point, the idea that the world, as it becomes more educated, more modern, more scientific, is going to become less religious, that idea has functioned in universities not just as a diagnosis, but as a prescription. Like, it's not just what will happen, it's what should happen. But what are Western academics going to do when they realize that it hasn't happened? And that atheism, rather than being the sort of belief system of diversity and progress, like everybody's been saying, is actually the belief system of white Western men and communist regimes. So a Chinese professor of sociology of religion in China named Fengeng Yang, who's based at Purdue University. And he says that in the next generation, the universities in the West are going to have to go through a paradigm shift, much like a scientific revolution, when the failure of the secularization hypothesis comes home to roost. Like when they realize that actually the world just isn't becoming less religious as it's becoming more educated. And even if you look just across the US today, some of the most educated demographics are actually also the most likely to attend church on a very regular basis. So I feel like, when 20 years ago, back when I was in the UK, people sort of assumed, like, if you were really well educated, you couldn't possibly believe in strange things that Christians believe. It was absurd to believe that there was a creator God of all the universe. It was foolish to believe many of the wild claims that Christians make. But actually, we can't have that sort of short circuit anymore to say, well, I don't have to think about Christianity because I'm an educated person. Maybe that's you. Maybe you've come in today and you're thinking, do you know what? I'm quite smart and I got a pretty good education. And so I don't even need to waste my time looking into Christianity or reading the Bible, because that's only for foolish, uneducated people. It's just not true, because Christianity has always been for everyone, actually, regardless of what your academic educational background is. And one of the beautiful things about Christianity, and I see this in my own life, actually, in my own church, in my own family, one of the beautiful things about Christianity is that a small child or somebody who might have a mental disability can actually grasp the beauty of who Jesus is. And the most highly educated, incredibly academic person can never feel like he or she has exhausted the riches that Christianity has to offer when it comes to the mind. And one of the big ironies is that for folks who think that Christianity has just been disproved or discredited by academic study, is that many of our top universities, both in the US and in the UK, were actually founded specifically to bring glory to Jesus. Did you know that? It's true where I come from in England, like universities like Cambridge and Oxford. It's also true of universities like sort of Harvard and Yale and many others over here. They were first founded to honor and glorify this first century Jewish man who never wrote a book, never ruled an empire, never sat on a throne, never led an army. And if we look even at the very things, the sort of areas of academic study that are supposed to have disproved the Christian faith, turns out that they often came to us from Christianity. So science would be a great example of this. In many people's minds, I think science is kind of like an alternative hypothesis to belief in a creator God. You either believe that God created the world or you believe in science. But actually, if you look back to the origins of what we now call science, the people who first came up with the sort of methods of science, did so because they believed in this creator God that they read about in the Bible. There's a guy at Princeton University named Hans Halvorson, who's a leading sociologist not sociologist of religion. He's a leading philosopher of science. And he says that not only is it true that it was Christians who first sort of developed what we now call science, but he says even today, Christianity gives you a better sort of philosophical foundation for science than atheism does. In fact, he says atheism doesn't give you a philosophical foundation for science at all. Now, don't get me wrong. Many of the best scientists up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and at Princeton and around the world are atheists. But that's not because science has proved atheism. And in fact, Hans Halvorson would say that the best an atheist can say about science is, "I'm so glad it works." Doesn't actually fit with their understanding of the universe. So rather than just kind of assuming that we can discount Christianity because it's anti-intellectual, maybe we need to look a little bit more closely. And if we do, we'll find that the same Jesus who told us we had to love even our enemies, those who were raised to hate, also said that we had to love God with all our heart and our soul and our mind and our strength. And he's not content with 3 out of 4. And if you look back over the last 2,000 years, you'll find some of the greatest literature has been written by Christians. You'll find that some of the greatest philosophy has been dreamt up by Christians. And you'll find that there are people whose minds have been so extraordinary that they have shaped even how people think today from hundreds of years ago, who are serious followers of Jesus, And if you look around the university today, you'll find people at the top, like world leaders in every academic field that's supposed to have disproved or discredited the Christian faith, who are serious followers of Jesus themselves. I spent nearly 10 years when I first moved to the US working for an organization called the Veritas Forum, where part of my job was meeting Christian professors at leading secular universities and hearing about their faith and how they came to be Christians and how they relate their academic study to their faith in Jesus. And it was so interesting because some of them were raised in Christian homes, but actually many of them weren't. I could tell you story after story of people who have come to faith in Jesus as part of their academic journey. In fact, I'll give you just one example. A friend of mine named Molly Worthen, who is a history professor at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And she became a Christian a couple of years ago because she came to the professional opinion as a historian that Jesus most likely did rise from the dead. And she was like, if that is true, it changes everything. And I can't just carry on sort of following what many of my other academic colleagues think about Christianity, because actually if Jesus rose from the dead, that means that everything in my life needs to change. It means I have a hope for eternity, and it means I have a meaning and a purpose now. It means everything has to change. So friends, I think we need to rethink the university, because Christianity, far from being anti-intellectual, is actually the greatest intellectual movement in all of history. Number 3, we need to rethink morality. One of my friends back in grad school in England is also now a history professor. I seem to have a lot of history professor friends. Her name is Sarah Irving Stonebreaker, and she comes from Australia originally. She grew up in Sydney, Australia. Her parents were very loving, highly educated, secular people, and she was sort of raised as a good kind of secular humanist, if that language means anything to you, and as a good liberal. And she came to Cambridge in the UK to do her PhD. And she was a convinced atheist when I knew her there. And then she went to Oxford University. I kind of have to spit when I say Oxford because, you know, as a Cambridge girl, it's disgusting in my mouth. But so just give me a moment to palate cleanse here. But, you know, she went to Oxford for her postgraduate work. And there, she went to a series of lectures by a fellow Australian who is a world-renowned atheist philosopher, a guy named Peter Singer. And she was super excited to go to these lectures, because like I say, he's kind of a hero of atheist philosophy. But during the course of these lectures, she found that her atheism just didn't fit with her deepest moral beliefs. You see, Peter Singer is one of these atheist philosophers who takes seriously the fact that if you don't believe in God, you can't just kind of carry on with Christian ethics as if nothing happened. You actually have to kind of rethink everything. And so instead of saying, as the Bible teaches, that all human beings are valuable because we're human, Peter Singer thinks that we should evaluate people and how kind of important or valuable they are according to various criteria. So, you know, what's their capacity for suffering? What's their capacity for self-awareness, etc. And by Peter Singer's calculations, a human infant is less morally valuable than an adult pig. Now, when my friend Sarah heard these lectures, she experienced what she described as sort of intellectual vertigo, as she realized that instead of supporting her deepest moral beliefs, her atheism actually sort of stuck a knife into the back of them. You know, she thought that Christianity was the enemy of all the things that she loved most, of care for the poor, of equality for men and women, of diversity, of love across racial difference. She thought that it was the enemy of those things, but as she looked further into it, she realized it was actually the basis for those things. And so she ended up putting her trust in Jesus. And I know friend after friend who has been through that process of discovering that their deepest moral beliefs are actually Christian beliefs. Now, I don't know almost any of your names. And I don't know where you live, you're probably relieved to hear this, or what you believe. But my guess is if I knocked on your door, or if you went and knocked on the doors of people who live in your neighborhood, and you asked them questions like this, do you think that all human beings are fundamentally equal in value? They say, yeah. You say, well, how about universal human rights? A big fan of human rights, or yes or no? They say, well, yeah, what kind of a weirdo are you? Of course I believe in universal human rights. How about men and women? Are they equally valuable, or men more important than women? They'd say, well, obviously women and men are equally valuable. How about care for the poor? Do you think anyone should care about the poor? Do you think anyone should care about those who are sick? Do you think anyone should care about those who are living under oppressive regimes? They'd say, well, yeah, of course I care about those. That's like basic moral common sense, right? You don't need any religion or philosophy to sort of tell you that. It's like the ABC of morality. But if you look into it, if you look historically, and if you even look into it today, you'll find that those are all specifically Christian beliefs. There's a British historian called Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man Tom Holland, the historian Tom Holland. And he wrote a fat book a few years ago called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And he himself is an agnostic. But he wanted to write this book about the history of Christianity in the West over the last 2,000 years. And as he did his research, he discovered that his deepest moral beliefs as an agnostic, somebody who doesn't believe in God, were actually Christian beliefs. And he said they're as Christian as the crazy idea that Jesus rose from the dead. Or think of, there's an Israeli historian and philosopher called Yuval Noah Harari, who, again, is somebody who doesn't believe in God at all. And he wrote a bestseller, a global bestseller a few years ago called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. And he's sort of looking at the history of humans as he sees it from the very beginning up until now. And he says things like this, he quotes the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And he says, the Americans got the idea of human equality from Christianity. But if we stop believing in God, who made humans and gave us souls and that kind of thing, what does it even mean to say that humans are equal? He says the scientific study of Homo sapiens has embarrassingly little to do with universal human rights and equality. He says Homo sapiens has no natural rights, just as chimpanzees, hyenas, and spiders have no natural rights. I mean, that's a very honest take from an atheist perspective, which is not to say that atheists can't believe and don't believe in universal human rights. I have many atheist friends who do, but it means they can believe it just like I can believe that olives are disgusting. I deeply believe that olives are disgusting, but at the end of the day, I know that really that's a taste of mine, a preference of mine, rather than something that I can impose on you. You might be olive lovers, and that's okay. We can both be, equally happy in our olive loving or hating world. And if Christianity isn't true, then universal equality and care for the poor, equality of men and women, the fact that the strong and the rich and the powerful don't have the right to trample on the weak and the poor and the marginalized, that all goes into the olive category. You might not prefer those things happen, but you shouldn't really impose your beliefs on other people because it's just your taste, it's just your preference at the end of the day. And when we think about what each of us most deeply long to be true, if you, like me, long for justice, if you, like me, long for love between people who may historically have not got on, if you, like me, long for a world where war has just become a thing of the past rather than something that we cannot seem to get rid of as a human society together, then you, like me, are longing for the very things that Jesus came and preached and shaped our hearts around. If you, like me, think that a human infant is actually profoundly more valuable than an adult pig, then that seed of belief and conviction has been sort of burrowed into your heart, whether you know it or not, by the teachings of this first century Jewish rabbi known to his contemporaries as Jesus of Nazareth. So let's rethink morality. but not from a self-righteous perspective, if you, like me, are a follower of Jesus. Paul, one of the guys who wrote a good amount of the New Testament and was one of Jesus' sort of first apostles going around spreading his message, he said this, this is a trustworthy saying worthy of full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. There's actually no way to share your faith in Jesus with your pride intact. And there's no way to become a Christian while thinking that you're actually probably a good person. So I don't mean this in a sort of self-righteous way, but I think we need to rethink morality, like divers pulling treasure from a wreck. And as Jesus would have us do, flee self-righteousness like toxic waste. Fourth, and perhaps most controversially, we must rethink sexuality. My best friend, Rachel, grew up in California, in a lovely sort of sunny, rural part of Southern California. She thinks, one day when Jesus comes back and establishes the heaven on earth that the Bible promises, that it's basically going to look and feel like Southern California. This is her sort of view. It's kind of offensive that it's not like Boston or even like New Jersey, but Southern California. But we'll have to forgive her for that. She was raised, like my friend Sarah, in a completely non-church-going home. And by the time she went to high school, she was a convinced atheist. In fact, she really wasn't a very nice person. She used to enjoy making her Christian classmates cry by asking them hard questions they couldn't answer. I don't choose my friends very well, apparently. But one of the other things that she realized while she was in high school was that the way that some of her female friends felt about other boys was how she felt about other girls. In fact, on a study date with a girl a couple of years older than her, she sort of realized, oh, wow, I think I'm like deeply attracted to this girl. And because, she didn't have any kind of religious scruples about pursuing a relationship with somebody of her same sex. So she started a sexual and romantic relationship with this young woman. A couple of years later, she had got into a dream college of Yale University. Her girlfriend was at Columbia, so, not too far away. She was living her best life, so excited to move from the West Coast to the East Coast. She reckons all the brochures for Yale showed only pictures from the fall. She was like, they didn't tell me about the winter hellscape that happens between, November and April. But she was like, just these beautiful pictures of like fall leaves and, nice sort of soft lighting. That was what she was expecting from Yale. And when she arrived at Yale, she had two rude awakenings. First was that she realized she wasn't half as smart as she thought. She was the best student in her very small high school in rural California, but she turned out she was not at all good compared to the other people at Yale. And the other rude awakening was she discovered her girlfriend was cheating on her, and they broke up. And she was really devastated by this. And she was sort of thinking, like, what do I do now? Like, my intellectual awesomeness has crumbled, and my relationship with this girl has crumbled, and it's absolutely freezing here, and nobody told me it was going to be so cold. And she thought, maybe I'll go to the gym, but she was like, no, I'm too lazy to go to the gym. And she thought, maybe I'll try to write for the student newspaper. She was like, no, I'm not smart enough to write for the student newspaper. Like, what am I going to do? And then she went to a philosophy lecture, which was on this old French dead philosopher called Descartes, who was sort of famous for saying, I think, therefore I am. And it was on Descartes' proof of the existence of God. And my friend Rachel thought to herself, that's a really dumb proof of the existence of God. I don't buy it. But she hadn't heard it before, and it kind of unsettled her because it seemed like there were at least some sort of intellectually credible people who really did believe in God. And so she thought, what should I do? Oh, I know, I'll Google. So she starts Googling, random religious terms, and she ends up reading a whole bunch of stories about Jesus from the Gospels and the Bible. And it was really surprising to her because she thought, like, her mental image of Jesus was a boring old conservative. She was like, I was imagining George W. Bush wrapped in a toga. Like, that was her picture of Jesus, and she was like, it wasn't an appealing idea. But the Jesus she was reading about in the Gospels was really smart. She was not prepared for how intelligent Jesus is. And he was also really loving in a way that she, like, not in a sort of saccharine Hallmark movie kind of way, but just like in a very real way that she wasn't ready for. And as she read, she found herself more and more attracted to this character of Jesus. But she realized, I've got a problem. Like, if I'm interested in Jesus, but I'm also interested in women, like, those two things don't go together. She sort of picked up from the ether that Christians were not in favor of same-sex marriage, and she was hoping to marry a woman someday. And so she went to visit the only two self-confessing Christians she knew at Yale, who were, conveniently for her, two young women who were dating one another. And she asked them, okay, you guys seem to have figured something out here. How can you sort of have Jesus, but then also have a same-sex relationship? And they said, yeah, it's actually been a big misunderstanding. If you read the Bible correctly, you'll find that it does actually allow for monogamous same-sex relationships. And Rachel was really pleased to hear this. So she went back to her dorm room. They gave her a little packet, a sort of booklet to read, explaining all the problematic verses. And she took it back to her dorm room and she read it through and she was like, this sounds great. Maybe I could even think about becoming a Christian. But she was a history major and she thought, I've got to look up the original text. I can't just rely on what this packet says. So she starts Googling, she doesn't have a Bible, like a physical Bible, she's just Googling again. She starts Googling the passages that this little booklet is explaining. And she said, as she did that, she realized that what the booklet was saying and what the Bible was saying were not the same thing. She was like, I'm no Bible scholar, but I can tell that this is not actually what that is. She was like, these young women are sweet, but I don't think they really know what's going on here. And she was actually really upset and angry, and she threw the booklet into a little trash can in her dorm room and felt dumb for having thought that Christianity might have room for somebody like her. Then a couple of weeks later, she was in the room of a classmate of hers, and she saw on this classmate's bookshelf a copy of a book that was called Mere Christianity. She really likes looking at other people's bookshelves and judging them, so she was basically kind of in judgment mode when she came across this, but she was like, I'm kind of interested in that. But she didn't want to tell her friend she was interested because that was embarrassing, and so she just stole the book. She just sort of took it off the bookshelf, put it in her bag, and she went off to class. And a couple of days later, she was reading this book in the Yale library, and she suddenly had this like overwhelming feeling, or this knowledge, it sort of zapped into her brain that God is real. And not only that God is real, but that he is what Christians use the strange term holy, like that he is perfect, and that by comparison with him, like when you realize how holy God is, you also realize how bad you are. And she had a moment of just nothing but fear. She was like, I knew I was a really bad, she was like, it's not just that she was sexually immoral from a Christian perspective. She was like, I was also mean, I was arrogant, I was reading a stolen book. Like, any way you looked at it, if there was a God, she was in trouble. But a moment later, she realized, that's why Jesus had to come and die. Because when Jesus died on the cross, he took the judgment, the righteous sort of just judgment, the punishment that she deserved, he took it himself. And so she was like, okay, the only way to be safe is to run toward Jesus, not to run away from him. And so in the library, sitting by herself, she just closed her eyes and said, oh, fine, I'll be a Christian. And that was it. I mean, she didn't want to become a Christian. She was like, she was like, Christians are lame. It's embarrassing to become a Christian. What's more, I'm going to have to let go of this possibility of marrying a woman someday. Like, this was, in some ways, it was kind of bad news for her life, but she could also tell that the deal Jesus was offering was too good to say no to. So she took the deal. Friends, I could tell you story after story of friends of mine who have similar backgrounds to Rachel. And I could also tell you my own story, which is sort of a little bit less colorful, shall we say. I grew up going to church. I've been a follower of Jesus for as long as I can remember. And from as early as I remember having sort of romantic feelings, they were always directed toward other women. So at one point in my life, if I could have found a way to read the Bible that would allow for same-sex marriage, I would have figured that out. Like, I didn't come to the Bible hoping it would say no to that. But over the years, the more I've read of the Bible, the more I've understood that actually, just like Snape, the story of the Bible when it comes to sexuality is not a story of hate, it's a story of love. You know, it's interesting because when I talk about Jesus to people in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and especially when we start talking about questions of sexuality, I move over in people's minds from like deluded to bigot. But just like when Harry dived into that pensieve, he realized that he'd completely misunderstood Snape's story. So I think that when we dive into the Bible, we find that it's a love story too, but it's just a much bigger love story than we were ready for. It starts at the very beginning of the Bible, when God makes humans male and female in his image, and he brings one man and one woman together in this, what's described as sort of one flesh union. It's a very strange comment that the Bible makes at the very beginning about this one man and one woman. It says, therefore, a man will leave his father and his mother, be united to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And it's kind of left there in the second chapter of the Bible to be picked up later. And then in Genesis 3, everything goes horribly wrong. This first man and woman turn away from God, and sin comes into the world, and everything starts going terribly wrong. And then we see throughout the Old Testament, we see example after example of things that are nothing like this one flesh union. You know, we see everything from polygamy to prostitution to rape to adultery. It doesn't look good. But at the same time, we start to hear a love story being told, and it's the love story of God and his people, the Israelites. Time and again, the prophets in the Old Testament talk about God as a husband and Israel, God's people, as his wife. But there's a problem because God's people keep cheating on him by worshiping other sort of fake gods. And it's kind of like a telenovela like drama that unfolds throughout the Old Testament as time and again God's people cheat on him, and then he forgives them and he brings them back, and then they cheat on him again, and it's a complete disaster. And then Jesus steps onto the stage of human history. And one of the strange things he says about himself is that he is the bridegroom. That's really odd. If you think about it, Jesus never married in his life on earth. It's very odd for him to say that he is like the bridegroom, he's the husband. So what's he talking about? Well, it's one of the ways he's stepping into the shoes of the creator God of the Old Testament. He's saying, I'm the husband. I've come to claim God's people for myself. And we see it as we read then through the New Testament. One of the letters that the Apostle Paul wrote to a church in a place called Ephesus, where he describes Christian marriage as being like a little scale model of Jesus' relationship with his people. And he says at the end of that passage, he quotes back to Genesis 2, where it says, therefore a man will leave his father and his mother, be united to his wife, they shall become one flesh. And he says, this is a profound mystery, and I'm saying it refers to Jesus, to Christ, and the church. So Paul's saying, from the very beginning, from when God made humans male and female, from when he made marriage in the first place, from when he made our bodies, from when he made us capable of sex and having children, all of that, it was always about Jesus and his people. And then if we go to the very end of the Bible, to the book of Revelation again, we hear this great shout going out, the wedding of the Lamb has come. And we see Jesus' marriage to his people bringing heaven and earth back together. Friends, this, according to the Bible, is why marriage is male and female. And it's why husbands and wives are called to different roles. Like Christ and the church, it's a love across difference. Like Christ and the church, it's a love built on sacrifice. Like Christ and the church, it's a life-creating, flesh-uniting, never-ending, exclusive love. Marriage is meant to point us to Christ, but it's also meant to disappoint us. Because even the best human marriage could only ever be a tiny echo of Jesus' overwhelming sacrificial love for us. And this, if I'm honest, this is where I think a lot of churches and a lot of Christians and a lot of pastors, I'm sure that's not true at this church, but in other churches, have sort of missed what the Bible is saying, because so often churches have kind of reacted to how non-Christian people think about sex and marriage and sexuality by making male-female marriage the destination. When in fact it's meant to be a signpost of something so much greater than itself. And if we read the New Testament, at the same time as we'll see this very kind of clear and specific picture of sex only belonging in male-female marriage, we also find that marriage is not the only relationship that is designed to point us to Jesus' love. In fact, the night that he was betrayed to his death by one of his closest friends, Jesus said this, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends." As I said, I think in a lot of churches, people would have finished the sentence differently. That, they would say, greater love has no one than this than the love of a husband and wife, or greater love has no one than this than the love of a mother for her baby. But Jesus says, greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. And as you read through the New Testament, which I really encourage you to do, one of the things you'll find is that there is an insistent, persistent, repeated call to love between believers. The New Testament says some beautiful and extraordinary and offensive things about sex and about marriage. But actually has far more to say about how followers of Jesus must love one another. It sort of bangs on and on and on and on and on about that. And so when I see yard signs in my neighborhood in Cambridge, Massachusetts that say, "Love is love," I want to say both a no and a yes to that, actually. Because from a Christian perspective, I know what that sort of is code for. And I need to say no to any kind of sexual relationship with somebody of the same sex. But from a Christian perspective as well, there is this deep and rich and beautiful vision for love between believers, and I think in particular between believers of the same sex. It's just a different vision than the vision of love and marriage. As one of Jesus' first followers, who was called John, wrote in a letter, he said, "God is love." And according to the Bible, God gives us little glimpses of his love for us in different kinds of human relationships. So marriage is one, parents and children is another, and friendship is another too. And I would say, in order to rethink sexuality, one of the things we need to do, if you, like me, are a follower of Jesus, is actually to open up our Bibles again and rediscover this deep love that we are called to with one another. Another young friend of mine who became a Christian just a couple of years ago, she'd honestly tried everything before she came to our church. She'd tried sex, she'd tried drugs, she'd tried meditation, she'd tried yoga, she'd tried sort of strange sort of spiritual ceremonies, the ayahuasca ceremonies, if that's familiar to any of you guys, sort of some of the new agey kind of stuff that's becoming quite kind of prevalent at the moment. She'd got tattoos, she'd tried alcohol, she'd tried everything. And in fact, she'd spent 18 months exclusively dating other young women because she'd sort of hadn't found what she was looking for in relationships with men, and so she concluded she must be a lesbian. And she'd got a tattoo of two naked women on her leg from this sort of period of her life. And I remember a couple of weeks after she came to our church, she said to me, "Oh, I've just realized, you guys have to love me. I could join any other group in Boston and they could discover that I'm weird and not want me anymore, but you guys don't have that choice. You have to love me." I said, "Yeah, the problem is you have to love us too." The epidemic of loneliness that our nation is going through, and that frankly the entire Western world has been going through, is more toxic to us than cancer. And if we open the pages of the Bible, we will find the exact treatment that we need. It is an unconditional love that flows out of the heart of the God of all the universe, and it flows into all of his followers and out from them to their brothers and sisters in the church and to the world around. It's a love that is glimpsed in the best of human marriage. And it's a love that's glimpsed in the most tender parent-child relationship. And it is a love that is glimpsed in the joyful, freeing, intimate sharing that we can have with friends. And it's a love that reaches out to those who are lonely. It's a love that doesn't ask, what can you do for me? But instead asks, how can I care for you? Friends, I don't know what you think about Jesus today. But I guarantee that if you open up the pages of the Bible, you, like my friend Rachel, won't find George W. Bush wrapped in a toga. You will find the most loving man you have ever encountered in your life. And you will find someone who makes extraordinary demands on you. I want to be very real with you. If you are not yet a Christian, if you're not yet a follower of Jesus, I am not here tonight asking you to consider adding a little sort of couple of hours on a Sunday morning to your weekly schedule. I'm here suggesting that you might want to hand over the keys of your entire life to somebody who can run it much better than you can. To somebody who knows you better than you know yourself and loves you more wildly than you could ever imagine. And here's the beautiful thing about Christianity. If you could see my thoughts on a daily basis, if I had a screen, if this screen, instead of saying questions asked anonymously, instead had all my thoughts popping up on it, and you could scroll through, the last week of my thoughts, I would have to run out of this building and never see any of you guys again, right? And I don't think I'm the only one. We might think that we're decently good people. If you actually think about the fact, between now and this time tomorrow, imagine if you had that screen above your head and everybody could read your thoughts. How much would you pay to not have that happen, right? So Jesus says, actually, out of your heart is coming all sorts of bad stuff. And according to the Bible, Jesus is the only person who can see our thoughts. He sees the absolute worst of us, and he's also the only person who has died for me and who has died for love of you. So don't settle for a meaningless life. Don't settle for a life that will inevitably end in death. Don't settle for a life where, at best, you could have a comfortable home and a loving nuclear family. Maybe consider whether this first century Jewish man who died on a cross and who his first followers claimed broke through death for you and for me could in fact be who he claims to be. So just to sum up, what I'm suggesting is that we might want to rethink diversity, rethink the university, rethink morality, and rethink sexuality, and to do all of these things with humility. If you, like me, are a follower of Jesus, we must lament the ways that racism has often infected churches over the decades. We must lament the ways in which Christians have often sort of run away from the life of the mind. We must lament the ways in which Christians have sometimes treated those who identify as gay or lesbian outside the church hatefully. Complete opposite of what Jesus calls us to do. And we must lament at the ways that we've actually failed to show up and love one another as Jesus has loved us. We need to take a hard turn away from ourselves and a hard turn actually toward the Bible. Because Jesus is not a relic of the ancient world. He is our modern world's best hope. Thank you. I'll get to sit down. How nice.
You do, yes. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for getting us started. Now we're going to continue, and you guys were great with submitting your questions. Thank you for that. Honestly, difficult to prioritize and sort through them because there were so many good ones. So I'm just gonna jump in.
Go for it.
And start, and we'll see where this takes us. So you spoke about morality and about where morality ultimately comes from. So somebody is asking, isn't it possible that the morality that we share is just good old common sense?
So it's really interesting. My friend Sarah, the history professor I mentioned, she, as a historian, had spent a lot of time studying different cultures throughout history and around the world. When she was first sort of considering Christianity and wondering if she needed to rethink her life from the ground up. And one of the observations she made was that the idea we have that really this is just basic moral common sense just does not stand up if you look at different cultures throughout history and across the world. If you look, for instance, let's think about when Christianity first was birthed into the Greco-Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. The idea that men and women were equal, not a thing in the Greco-Roman world. I mean, it's pretty obvious to them that women were inferior to men. The idea of sexual consent, not a thing, unless, like, if you were a freeborn woman, like if you were sort of in the protected, wealthy, high-class group, then there was a concept of sexual consent for you. This is probably the one, moral, claim when it comes to sexual ethics that everybody in our culture agrees with. Like, rape is wrong, right? We probably all, I hope we're all on the same page with that. But in the Greco-Roman Empire that Christianity was born into, if you were a slave, or if you were a prostitute, who most often prostitutes had been raised as slaves, and it was a very much overlapping categories there, nobody asked whether you consented to your master using you sexually. It was part of what you were there for. No more would I ask this chair if I could sit down on it than a Roman master would ask a slave if he could have sex with them. So it turns out, I can understand where you're coming from, because when you talk to people in your neighborhood who identify as Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, atheist, agnostic, whatever, because they all are saying, oh yeah, this is what we agree with, it feels like it must be common sense. But that's actually only because we've all been infected with Christianity. And again, I'd point to Tom Holland's analysis of that. He talks about how Christianity has sort of been, Christian ethics has been sort of packaged in a way to make it acceptable to people from different cultural backgrounds, at least to some degree, so that things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights could be constructed. It's basically Christian ethics. And there are some Muslim countries who are like, no, we see what you're doing. We see this as Christian ethics. We're just trying to pretend God isn't there, and we're not buying it.
That's good. I'm just going to go right for the most volatile one, because you already brought it up. A person said LGBTQ issues have been so divisive in the church. And the person's asking, if Jesus came back today, what would he say about it?
So here's where I stand from careful reading of the scriptures. Number one, the more I've read of the scriptures, the more I become convinced that the Bible is actually very clear in its no to any same-sex sexual relationships for Christians. And again, I didn't come to that conclusion because I wanted it to be the conclusion. I wasn't looking for that conclusion. I've looked quite carefully at both the Old and the New Testament. I even read a short book called Does the Bible Affirm Same-Sex Relationships? So I'm sort of looking at the 10 most common arguments people make for Christians agreeing with same-sex marriage for believers, and why actually none of them stands up. So it was one of the distinctives of Christianity from the beginning. And so I don't think it's an agree to disagree kind of issue for Christians today. I think it's actually a kind of one of the issues on which Christians should, in fact, divide and sort of, in Christian terms, sort of break fellowship. So I don't think it's agree to disagree. So I think Jesus would say to Christians who have said, this is fine, or we can agree to disagree on that. I think he would say, have you not read the Bible? At the same time, I think from the scriptures that there is much to be repented of in terms of how Christians have treated people who identify as gay or lesbian outside the church. Because, one of the radical things that Jesus taught, and I was actually reading it just earlier today in my own sort of Bible reading, Jesus says, you guys, if you're followers of me, you don't just need to love the people who are like you, you need to love your enemies. He says you need to love your neighbor, and then he defines your neighbor as the person you were raised to hate. So there is literally no category of person who I, as a follower of Jesus, am not called to love. I'm not called to tolerate people, I'm called to love them, right? And the ways in which, sadly, people who agree that the Bible says no to same-sex marriage, for example, have often treated people who identify as gay or lesbian is utterly at odds with what the Bible teaches. So I think Jesus would have I think Jesus does have some very hard words to say to people who have treated those, again, outside the church who identify as gay or lesbian historically. I think he'd also have some hard words to say about how churches have often treated people who, like me, grew up in the church, experiencing attraction to people of my same sex. And it's almost been put in this different category from any other kind of sinful desire. And the fact is, Christianity is offensive, okay? It's offensive to me and it's offensive to you. Because one of the things that Jesus is very clear about is that all of us have sinful desires coming out of our hearts, like pretty much constantly. It's not like we're basically good, but we need a little, we need a little bit of better moral instruction. Or like if only we'd had a better childhood, we'd be, even better than we are now. No, we didn't just need a guru or a moral example. We needed a savior. We needed somebody to die for us. Like, that's really bad. That's really offensive, right? But at the same time, the way that we've sometimes put one kind of sinful desire in this special category versus others, I don't see that in the scriptures at all. And it's robbed believers like me of the opportunity to sort of shoulder up with fellow believers in the fight against sin and to give one another the love and support that we in fact need.
So let me stay on that topic just a little bit more, if I could. So you have shared your story that you've had those same-sex attraction desires, and yet, by God's grace, you're in a loving heterosexual marriage. What would you say to those gay and lesbian friends who they just don't feel that that's an option for them? They don't feel that there's any sense of attraction to the opposite sex, and they'd say, well, easy for you to say, Rebecca, now you have a husband, you have kids, where does that leave me?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think our churches, predominantly churches in the West, have got really wrong in the last several decades is that we have failed to read what the Bible says about singleness. Now, I mentioned the Apostle Paul, one of the people who wrote a significant portion of the New Testament. And he has beautiful, amazing things to say about marriage. He says marriage is this picture of Jesus' love for his people. Like, that's pretty cool, right? And he says singleness is even better. In many of our churches, we have no idea what to do with that because we have made everything about marriage. And ironically, we've done exactly what the rest of the world is doing. I don't need to tell you that in our culture writ large, romantic love has become the thing. Like if you don't have a sexual romantic partner, like, who are you even in our culture, right? It's like as if this is the pinnacle of human existence, and there is nothing sadder than the idea of somebody not having a sexual romantic partner, and nothing more cruel than to deprive somebody of the possibility of a sexual romantic partner. Because like we've raised sexual romantic love to be, the real McCoy. That's probably an English thing as well.
No, we got that too.
Okay, good. The Bible actually doesn't do that. It says marriage is really good, and singleness is actually also really good. And you're like, well, how can that be? I mean, people will sometimes say to me, how can you expect somebody who's only ever attracted to their same sex to be lonely for the rest of their life? And I would say, if it is the reality for single brothers and sisters in our churches that they are lonely, we have some serious problems. We are not reading our New Testament, and we are not living according to Jesus' instructions. We are not loving one another as he has loved us. Now, to sort of flip that on its head, or to give you an example from the other direction, there are two guys in their probably like early 40s or late 30s, sort of around about that age, who I connect with somewhat regularly, one from our church and one from the coffee shop where I most often do my writing. Both of them, as far as I know, are exclusively attracted to other guys. And my friend Lou at church has always been a Christian, therefore has not pursued a same-sex marriage for himself, and he is deeply embedded in our church community. There are multiple like little kids in church who he's like their favorite uncle. He vacations with families from the church or with other sort of single and married friends. He is at the center of our church community and deeply loved and valued. My other friend who's not a Christian at all and is same-sex attracted, when he vacations, he goes on cruises by himself. And when he first told me that, it was just sort of really striking to me, because I thought, according to the narrative of our culture, my friend Lou, who has said no to his own sort of sexual romantic fulfillment because he's a follower of Jesus, he is meant to be depressed and lonely and miserable and living the worst imaginable life. And my other friend is meant to be living his absolute best life. He's got all the sexual freedom that he could ever have wanted. And in fact, reading between some lines, I'm pretty sure that if I were to give any person in this room the choice between his life or Lou's life, we would all swing for Lou's life. Because actually what we need is love, not sex. Sex is great and all, but actually what we all need desperately is love. And that is something that the Christian community offers in spades, and if it doesn't, then we're in serious trouble with Jesus.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to shift gears. How do you reconcile Genesis with scientific views of origins?
Yeah, great question. So for those who aren't as familiar with the first few chapters of the Bible, in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we have accounts of how God made the universe. And in Genesis 1, it's sort of a creation of the whole universe, and sort of culminates in the creation of the first human beings, when God says, let's make man in our own image, in the image of God. He created them, male and female, he created them. And then in Genesis 2, it's sort of like we zoom in on the creation of this particular man and woman. Now, Christians have been arguing about how Genesis relates to the science of their day since at least the 4th century. So there's a guy called Augustine of Hippo, or St. Augustine, sometimes known as, who, from at least back then, Christians were debating with one another how their understanding of God's creation related to the science of their day. And that is true today as well. And if you look at every famous controversy in the history of science and Christianity, so whether it's sort of Galileo, or whether it's evolution and Darwin, or whether it's the Big Bang, you name it, one of the things that's interesting when you actually look into it is that there are Christians on both sides of all of those debates. And that rather than, the sort of new atheists like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and those kinds of guys, would always tell the story of how the brave secular scientists beat the foolish, bigoted Christian who was trying to believe the Bible and couldn't understand science. And that's just not the history of science. Instead, often Christians are at the very forefront of scientific discovery. For example, the Big Bang was first dreamt up by a Roman Catholic priest. People don't often know that. So that doesn't answer all of those questions, but it just says we sort of need to complicate this narrative of there's science over here and there's Christianity over here. Now, one of the things that I'm quite convinced about from Genesis 1 and 2 is that they're actually not primarily trying to teach us science. Now, that doesn't, I'm not saying that that kind of vomits out a specific answer of how we relate these to understandings of creation from modern science. But Genesis 1 and 2 are pretty clearly focusing on teaching us about who God is and who we are in relation to God and in relation to one another and in relation to creation. Now, I'm not saying they have nothing to say about science, but that's not their primary concern. And so I would encourage you, if you haven't read Genesis 1 and 2, to open up a Bible, read those first chapters, and just pay careful attention to what's being said, because you might find it's actually a lot more interesting than you had imagined. Now, when it comes to that question of how does it relate to any particular sort of understanding of creation that we have today from a scientific perspective, I know literal world leaders in all of those fields who are serious Christians. So whether we're talking about evolution or whether we're talking about the Big Bang or whether we're talking about astronomy, I know people who are, as I say, followers of Jesus, many of them who become Christians as part of their sort of journey of discovery as they went further and further in science. So again, I don't think we can sort of reduce it to, well, there's science over here and there's kind of faith over there. But I don't think there's a simple way of putting those two things together. I think also, sorry, it's kind of a long, rambly answer, but one last comment. If you read Genesis 1 and 2 together, one of the things you cannot do, and I don't think it's asking us to do, is read them, quote, literally, line by line. Now, why do I say that? When God gives a commandment to the first man, he says, you can eat of any of the fruit of any of the trees in this garden I put you in, but there's one tree you can't eat from. You can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he says, on the day that you eat of that tree, you will die. Adam and Eve famously go ahead and eat from that tree, and they don't die that day. Now, there are various different ways we could look at that. We could say, okay, when God said day, he wasn't meaning a 24-hour period. He was meaning, the process of your death will start when that happens, which is one perfectly reasonable approach to that. We could say, well, when he said, on the day that you eat it, you'll die, he didn't mean physical death. He meant like a spiritual alienation from God. It's also a perfectly reasonable thing to say on that. Or we can say, well, God said that, but he wasn't actually going to do it. It's sort of, if you read the Bible carefully, you will often find that the Bible is telling us things through non-literal language. For instance, when Jesus says, I am the true vine, none of us think that he's saying he was a plant, right? We recognize he's using a metaphor to tell us a profound truth. And so I think we can sometimes get into this sort of brittle division between, do you take the Bible literally or do you not? And so, what I try to do is to read the Bible faithfully, and that will sometimes mean that I read it sort of as a historical account. It'll sometimes mean there are portions where it's very clearly telling us that this is a story or a metaphor. And there are other times when Bible-believing Christians have genuine debates and disagreements. And I think there are pieces of Genesis 1 and 2 where it's just the genuine debates and disagreements.
That's good. Yeah, I always say read portions of the Bible as they were intended to be read, which is different for different portions of the Bible, right? Yeah. Somebody writes, I am struggling to forgive someone who hurt me deeply. How do I extend the love of Jesus to forgive? And is that even psychologically healthy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because there's a sort of easy response that we can sometimes have, which is like, and actually the New Testament is quite explicit about this, is that if you are a follower of Jesus, you need to forgive other people just as you have been forgiven. And then actually if we withhold forgiveness from other people, then God says, well, what if I withhold forgiveness from you? When we realize quite how much we needed to be forgiven, we'll sort of recognize what a big deal that is. And it doesn't mean that we need to trivialize how somebody else might have sinned against us. I don't know who it is who asked this question, but my guess is whoever it is, you're probably not the only person in this room who has been hurt very, very deeply by somebody else, and where we can rightly say somebody has profoundly sinned against you. And I think the Bible gives us the resources to at the same time recognize profound sin and say, like, that is actually evil, that is wrong, that should not have happened. There needs to be like an accounting for that. It can't just be swept under the rug. And I'm going to extend forgiveness because Jesus has forgiven me. Now, it's not a cheap forgiveness, because the only reason Jesus can forgive us is because he actually died for our sin. It wasn't cheap. It was exceedingly costly. And sometimes for us to forgive other people is going to feel a bit like that, to be honest. It's going to feel excruciating. I don't think forgiving somebody always means sort of resuming relationship with them. I think that there are situations where it's in fact appropriate to maintain like meaningful distance from somebody who has sinned against us very profoundly. But it does involve forgiving them from our hearts, and we may need to pray earnestly for the Lord's help with that. And my guess is it won't be like a one and done thing, it'll be an ongoing thing. But one of the beautiful and humbling truths of the Christian faith is that we're all actually a lot more sinful than we realize. And we're also a whole lot more loved. So part of the process of forgiving somebody else is sometimes recognizing that we're actually not so different from them, even if they've done something truly devastating and terrible to us. And Jesus' recommendation to us, or even his commandment to us, is that we pray for our enemies. And it maybe this person is someone who's kind of in that category for you. And one of the best things that you could do could be to pray for them.
The world saw a tragedy in Switzerland on New Year's Eve with the fire in the nightclub. We saw a much closer to home version of that a couple of months ago as a woman was killed in a fire right here in our town. How does that happen if God is good and powerful?
Yeah, I think that the question of how can you believe in a God who is both loving and powerful in light of all the suffering we see in the world is one of the hardest questions, and one of the questions that will always come up if I talk with somebody for long enough about Jesus. And here's the thing about Jesus. At the very center of the Christian message is Jesus' agonizing death on a Roman cross. So number one, Christianity is not offering a sort of distant God who smiles benignly down upon us but doesn't get involved. Christianity is saying that the God who made the universe became a human being in the person of Jesus Christ and died for love of you and me. It endured the most horrific suffering, like beyond what we could imagine, mental, physical, spiritual suffering for us. So it cannot be that God doesn't care. The most helpful and sort of satisfying portion of the Bible that I find when it comes to this question is a chapter in John's Gospel, so the last of the biographies of Jesus in the Bible. It's John chapter 11, if you want to go home and read it tonight. And it tells the story of when two of Jesus' close friends, Mary and Martha, who lived in a little town called Bethany, called to Jesus because their brother Lazarus was very sick. And their message to Jesus was this: Lord, the one you love is sick. Jesus, they're emphasizing how much Jesus loved their brother. And we know if you read through the Gospels, you'll see Jesus healing people left and right. So they're clearly thinking, great news, our brother's sick, but we know the best healer in town. Jesus is going to come, he's going to heal Lazarus. And John says, the Gospel writer, he says, Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and he didn't come. And you think, wait, what? Like, it would make sense if it said Jesus loved Mary and Martha, and so he dropped everything and ran to Bethany and healed Lazarus. Or it would make sense if it said Jesus didn't really care about Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and he was busy that day, so he didn't bother to come. But instead, John says Jesus loved them, and he deliberately waited until Lazarus was dead. And then he came, and Martha came out to meet him, and she said what probably you or I would have said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But then she said, but even now I know that whatever you ask of God, he will give you. You know, do you hear her faith? Her brother's dead, and she still thinks that Jesus can help. And Jesus gives her what at first feels like a sort of theological answer. He says, your brother will rise again. And many Jews of Jesus' day, including Martha, believed that at the very end of time that God would raise his faithful people from the dead. And so Martha says, yes, Lord, I know that he will rise again at the resurrection on the last day. But you can sort of sense the disappointment in her voice. Like, what about now, Jesus? What about now? You know, she didn't send him that message because she wanted her brother to be raised at the end of time. And then Jesus looks into the eyes of this grieving woman, and he says some of the most extraordinary words ever spoken on this planet. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even though he dies, will live, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Jesus is saying, I'm not a means to an end. I'm not the way for you to get your brother back. I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus is saying, if you have a relationship with me, you are alive even if you die. And if you don't, you are dead even if you look like you're alive. And he says to Martha, do you believe this? And she says, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. So we see there that Jesus deliberately set up this situation so he could have this conversation with Martha, and for her to see that what she most needed was not her brother back, but was him. And I think so often, I've been a Christian for as long as I can remember, and often it seems like prayer is about me trying to get God to change my circumstances. And I have to continually remind myself, no, my circumstances are here to get me to pray. Like, it's actually a relationship with God that is the most important thing. And the offer that Jesus makes and the promise that he speaks is not that your life or my life will be easy, or that we won't go through pain or suffering, but that if we trust in him, that even if we die, we will live. And we see that in the rest of that story in John 11, when Jesus goes to Lazarus' grave, he weeps with Mary and Martha, because it's not that he doesn't care. And then he calls Lazarus out of the grave. And John says the man who was dead came out. If there is no God, we still have the suffering, we still have the fires, we still have the senseless violence, we still have the tragedies, we still have the cancer, but we have absolutely no hope or meaning. We have a world where Homo sapiens have no natural rights, just as chimpanzees, hyenas, and spiders don't have any natural rights. We have a world in which a newborn baby is no more valuable than an adult pig. We have a world where you and I are close to death, however young or old we are, and there is nothing more for us. But if Jesus is who he claims to be, then he is the one person who can call us out of death into everlasting life with him. I have 3 kids, as Dave mentioned, and when my girls were younger, they're now 15 and 13, when they were about, I think, sort of 7 and 5, we were driving past a cemetery near where we live, and one of my daughters said, oh, Mum, is that where all the dead people are? I said, yeah. She said, ew. I said, don't be too superior, you'll be one of them one day. But I said, one day, if you've trusted in Jesus, after you are dead and buried and have rotted away in your grave, one day Jesus will call to you, Miranda, come out. Eliza, come out. And you will walk out of your grave to everlasting life with him. That's what I've staked my hope on. And the alternative isn't a world where there is no suffering. It's a world where our suffering has absolutely no meaning and purpose.
Last question. Last time I heard you speak, you said something like, you have never seen the level of openness and spiritual interest, and I believe you said not only in the States, but even in your country of origin as well. What is going on? And maybe you could give a word of how to respond to that for the Christians that are here and for the people that would not call themselves Christians here. What do we do at this moment?
Yeah, as I've mentioned, I've been a Christian for a really long time, and I've been trying to tell people about Jesus for basically as long as I can remember. And I have never experienced the level of openness that I experience now. And it's not, I think some people think this is like, oh, this is like a political kind of vibe shift in the US. I come from the UK and I'm seeing the same thing happening there. It's actually not tied to any particular kind of political this or that. My suspicion is that what has happened is that the sort of secular tape has played out. And there are a lot of people like my friend Justine with the lesbian tattoos who've tried everything, and they're now thinking, okay, I think I'm going to try Jesus. In fact, the guy I mentioned at our local coffee shop, I was flabbergasted a few weeks ago because another of the baristas there, who's a lesbian atheist friend of mine who we talk about all the things about Jesus and the gospel and Christian sexual ethics and everything. And she came and told me, she was sort of like, oh, by the way, smile on her face. She was like, by the way, you'll be surprised to hear this, but the other guy, I won't mention his name for sort of confidentialities, he wants to talk to you because he went to a Christian's wedding recently and was really struck by what he saw there, and he's wondering if maybe he would like to come to your church. Now, this guy, I cannot tell, like the last couple of years I've known him, because I write in the coffee shop, I then give them the books that I've written. I'm like, here's a short book on how church should save your life. Here's a short book on how Christmas is really, about Jesus. So I shamelessly use it as opportunities to give my lovely pagan barista friends evangelistic books. And he always receives them in the most, there's a wonderfully English thing you can do of sort of receiving something in a way that's both polite, but also indicates you will absolutely not be reading the book. I will take this and it will collect dust on my shelf. Thank you so much. I was shocked that he was expressing an openness to conversations about Jesus, like a genuine, spiritual interest. But I shouldn't have been, because I'm seeing it a lot, of people who sort of demographically shouldn't have been the kind of person who would be interested in Christianity, and who are showing up at our church saying, tell me about Jesus. I don't know exactly what's going on, but if you, like me, are a follower of Jesus, now is the time to invite any and everyone you know to church, to ask spiritual questions to your friends, even if they have for decades not been remotely interested in Christianity. Maybe it's your grandchildren, maybe it's your neighbor's grandchildren, whoever it is. And please do not assume from somebody's appearance or demographics that they wouldn't be interested in Jesus. Again, I know people who's on every metric you would think, oh, that person wouldn't be interested. In fact, a few months ago in our community group, we have about 25 people come Bible study at our house. And I said, raise your hand if 5 years ago your friends would looked at you and said there is no way he or she would become a Christian. 7 people raised their hands. So we're just seeing a lot of crazy stuff in the best possible way. Yeah,
and what about people who would not consider themselves Christians? Any advice for them during this moment?
Yeah, I would say, the book I most recently published was called How Church Could Save Your Life. And to save you having to buy it, I'll give you the skinny. There's a lot of data, evidence, published by the Harvard School of Public Health and other places, showing that regular church attendance is one of the best things you can do for your mental and physical health. So it's almost as good as quitting smoking. It's almost as good as exercise. So if you're lazy, come to church, okay? So I would say, try coming to church. Because one of the things that's been true from the very beginning, and Jesus was clear about this, he said to his disciples, his first followers, This is how people will know you're my disciples, because of your love for one another. I've never been to this particular church before. My impression from the last few hours of chatting with people has been that this is a church where people actually love each other. So if you are considering Christianity, not considering Christianity, but have been dragged along by a friend or relative, maybe just try coming to this church and see if there's more love here than you were anticipating. I would encourage you as well to grab a Bible and maybe start reading one of the gospel accounts of Jesus' life. They're very short. The shortest one, Mark's gospel, you could read in the same time it takes to watch like a short movie. And the longest one, Luke, you could read in the same time it takes to watch like Wicked, or one of the longer kind of movies that's around at the moment. And just see if, like my friend Rachel, you might find Jesus to be not quite how you expected or who you expected. And maybe consider doing that for yourself. Consider doing it maybe alongside somebody else. Maybe you have a Christian friend, and you could say, listen, I'm not about to start following Jesus, just to be clear, but maybe you and I could read through a gospel together, and like I could ask you my questions, or we could discuss it. I could tell you why I think it's crazy. Just have that kind of conversation. I would encourage that.
Thank you. We could definitely go on for a couple hours. You guys have submitted so many more questions, and sorry if I didn't get to yours, but this was a good representative of what you guys were thinking. Rebecca, just on behalf of the chapel, we want to say thank you for being with us tonight. This has been rich. Such a good week. Thank you.
May I add one more 30-second comment?
You may.
Sorry. So a few months ago, I was at an airport, and I was sitting with a guy who had grown up in church, walked away from church. We got into a conversation about Jesus. And I explained the gospel message of who Jesus is and how he died for our sins and was raised to new life, and that our only hope in the face of a just God is to run towards him. And I said to him, I need to be clear with you. You're about to get on a plane. If that plane goes down and you have not trusted in Jesus, you are still facing God's just punishment of your sin. So I actually need to plead with you now to repent and put your trust in Jesus. And he said, yeah, a lot of planes have been going down recently. I said, I know, that's what I'm telling you. Like, don't wait till tomorrow. So I just want to slightly correct my last answer to the last question. My first piece of advice, if you are not a Christian here tonight, is tonight, put your trust in Jesus, because you may not wake up tomorrow. And I don't say that sort of glibly, but actually today might be the day that you are being called by Jesus to repent and put your trust in him.
Thank you. That was a great 30 seconds. So we want to thank you for being with us tonight, and I know a lot of you are from the chapel, a lot of you are not, but I want to affirm what Rebecca said a moment ago. This really is a church that loves each other deeply, and I love that about this place. So I hope you have felt welcomed here tonight. We have some closing words we want to share with you, and for that, Rebecca and I are going to walk off the stage, and Julie Barclay is going to walk onto the stage.
All right, wow. Thank you so much again to Rebecca for coming out and just sharing so much of her wisdom and experience with us. I know that I'm leaving tonight feeling really blessed, and I hope that you are too. I just want to take a moment to let you know about some things going on as you leave. So Rebecca has graciously offered to stay behind a little bit tonight for anyone who wants to chat with her. So over on the side here in the lobby by the child care check-in area, there's an area where you can meet Rebecca, or if you'd like your book signed. There's also a book table, so we have some of Rebecca's books available for sale out in the lobby, so you can stop by that on your way out if you're interested. I also want to thank our volunteer team to put on this size event. It takes a lot of behind-the-scenes help, so thank you so much to our tech team and maintenance crew, and especially I just want to highlight Julie Vandervolk. Although she could not be here tonight to see the fruit of all of her labor, she was the backbone behind the planning of this event, so thank you so much to Julie Vandervolk on her staff for everything that she did for this. Let's just give our volunteer team a big... So our event is now coming to a close, but these conversations are going to be continual and ongoing here at the chapel. And one way we're going to do that, starting this coming Sunday, if you signed up for our next J-term course, that is starting this Sunday after service. And this is going to be a great opportunity for us to dig deeper into this topic of apologetics. So we're really looking forward to that. Another thing that Rebecca and Dave just talked about is the openness that we're seeing right now to people inquiring about the faith, just curious. And so if that's you, if you're new to the faith, if you're not sure about the faith, if you have questions about the faith, or if you know someone in that category, which I think we can all say we do, we have a great opportunity coming up in February. It is called Alpha. And this is a series of gatherings where you can just get together and you can ask your questions over a meal and conversation. So you can go on our website, thechapel.org, to find out more information and to register for that. And lastly, as Dave mentioned, we would love, if you're not part of our church here already, we would love for you to join our community. We have Sunday morning services 3 times, 8:40, 10 o'clock, and 11:20. They are all identical services, and all of them do have child care programs available called Chapel Kids. It's not just child care, it's an experience for your kids as well to grow in their faith. We would love for you to come out and join us and be a part of the love that we are at the Chapel family here. So that concludes our event for tonight. Thank you so much for coming, and have a good night.